Good wishes to all of you. History of Modern India. Chapter 3 European Penetration and the British Conquest of India audiobook. A new phase in Europe's eastern trade. India's trade relations with Europe go back to the ancient days of the Greeks. During the Middle Ages, trade between Europe and India and Southeast Asia was carried on along several routes. The Asian part of the trade was carried on mostly by Arab merchants and sailors, while the Mediterranean and European part was the virtual monopoly of the Italians. Goods from Asia to Europe passed through many states and many hands. A trader remained highly profitable. The old trading routes between the East and the West came under Turkish control after the Ottoman conquest of Asia Minor and the capture of Constantinople in 1453. Moreover, the merchants of Venice and Genoa monopolized the trade between Europe and Asia and refused to let the new nation states of Western Europe, particularly Spain and Portugal, have any share in the trade through these old routes. The West European states and merchants therefore began to search for new and safer sea routes to India and the Spice Islands in Indonesia, then known as the East Indies. They wanted to break the Arab and Venetian trade monopolies, bypass Turkish hostility, and open direct trade relations with the East. They were well equipped to do so, as great advances in shipbuilding and the science of navigation had taken place during the 15th century. Moreover, the Renaissance had generated a great spirit of adventure among the people of Western Europe. The first steps were taken by Portugal and Spain, whose seamen, sponsored and controlled by their governments, began a great era of geographical discoveries. In 1492, Columbus of Spain set out to reached India and discovered America instead. In 1498, Vasco da Gama of Portugal discovered a new and all sea route for Europe to India. He sailed around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope and reached Calicut. He returned with a cargo which sold for 60 times the cost of his voyage. These and other navigational discoveries opened a new chapter in the history of the world. The 17th and 18th centuries were to witness an enormous increase in world trade. The vast new continent of America was open to Europe, and relations between Europe and Asia were completely transformed. Another major source of early capital accumulation or enrichment for European countries was their penetration of Africa in the middle of the 15th century. In the beginning, the gold and ivory of Africa had attracted the foreigner. Very soon, however, trade with Africa centered around the slave trade. In the 16th century, this trade was a monopoly of Spain and Portugal. Later, it was dominated by Dutch, French, and British merchants. Year after year, particularly after 1650, thousands of Africans were sold as slaves in the West Indies and in North and South America. The slave ships carried manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, exchanged them on the coast of Africa for African slaves, took these slaves across the Atlantic and exchanged them for the colonial produce of plantations or mines, and finally brought back and sold this produce in Europe. It was on the immense profits of this triangular trade that the commercial supremacy of England and France was to be based. A great deal of West European and North American prosperity was based on the slave trade and the plantations worked by slave labor. Moreover, the profits of slave trade and the slave workers' plantations provided some of the capital which financed the industrial revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. A similar role was later played by the wealth extracted from India. In the 16th century, European merchants and soldiers also began the long process of first penetrating and then subjecting Asian lands to their control. Portugal had a monopoly over the highly profitable Eastern trade for nearly a century. In India, Portugal established its trading settlements at Cochin, Goa, Diu, and Daman. From the beginning, the Portuguese combined the use of force with trade. In this, they were helped by the superiority of their armored ships, which enabled them to dominate the seas. A handful of Portuguese soldiers and sailors could maintain their position on the seas against the much more powerful land powers of India and Asia. By threatening Mughal shipping, they also succeeded in securing many trading concessions from the Mughal emperors under the viceroyalty of Alfonso Alfonso de Albuquerque, who captured Goa in 1510. The Portuguese established their domination over the entire Asian coast from Hormuz in the Persian Gulf to Malacca in Malaya and the Spice Islands in Indonesia. They seized Indian territories on the coast and waged constant war to expand their trade and dominance and safeguard their trade monopoly from their European rivals, nor did they shy away from piracy and plunder. They also indulged in human cruelties and lawlessness. In spite of their barbaric behavior, their possessions in India survived for a century because they enjoyed control over the high seas. The soldiers and administrators maintained strict discipline, and they did not have to face the might of the Mughal Empire as South India was outside Mughal influence. In the later half of the 16th century, England and Holland and later France, all growing commercial and naval powers, waged a visibly fierce struggle against the Spanish and Portuguese monopoly over world trade. In this struggle, they later had to go under. The English and the Dutch merchants were now able to use the Cape of Good Hope route to India and so join in the race for empire in the east. In the end, the Dutch gained control over Indonesia and the British over India, Sri Lanka, and Malaya. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company was formed and the Dutch States General, the Dutch Parliament, gave it a charter empowering it to make war, conclude treaties, acquire territories, and build fortresses. The main interest of the Dutch lay not in India but in the Indonesian islands of Java, Sumatra, and the Spice Islands, where spices were produced. They soon turned out the Portuguese from the Malaya Straits and the Indonesia islands and in 1623 defeated English attempts to establish themselves there. They also established trading depots at Surat, Broch, Cambay, and Ahmedabad in Gujarat in West India, Cochin in Kerala, Nagapatnam in Madras, Masulipatam in Andhra, Chinsura in Bengal, Patna in Bihar, and Agra in Uttar Pradesh. In 1658, they also conquered Sri Lanka from the Portuguese. The English merchants looked greedily at the Asian trade. The success of the Portuguese, the rich cargoes of spice, calicos, silk, gold, pearls, drugs, porcelain, and ebony they carried, and the high profits they made inflamed the imagination of the merchants of England and made them impatient to participate in such profitable commerce. As English association or company to trade with the East was formed in 1599 under the auspices of a group of merchants known as the Merchant Adventurers. The company, popularly known as the East India Company, was granted a royal charter and the exclusive privilege to trade in India in the easy East by Queen Elizabeth on 31st December 1600. In 1608, it decided to open a factory, the name given at the time to a trading depot at Surat on the west coast of India, and sent Captain Hawkins to Jahangir's court to obtain royal favors. Consequently, the English company was given permission by a royal firman to open factories at several places on the west coast. The English were not satisfied with this concession. In 1615, their ambassador Sir Thomas Roy reached the Mughal court. Roy succeeded in getting an imperial firman to trade and establish factories in all parts of the Mughal Empire. In 1662, the Portuguese gave the islands of Bombay to King Charles II of England as dowry for marrying a Portuguese princess. Eventually, the Portuguese lost all their possessions in India except Goa, Diu and Daman. The English company fell out with the Dutch company over the division of the spice trade of the Indonesian islands. The intermittent war in India between the two powers, which had begun in 1654, ended in 1667 when the English gave up all claims to Indonesia while the Dutch agreed to leave alone the English settlements in India. The growth of the East India Company's trade and influence 1600 to 1714. The English East India Company had very humble beginnings in India. By 1623, it had established factories, trading posts at Surat, Broj, Ahmedabad, Agra, and Masulipatanam. From the very beginning, it tried to combine trade and diplomacy with war and control of the territory where their factories were situated. Conditions in the south were more favorable to the English as they did not have to face a strong Indian government there. The great Vizianagara kingdom had been overthrown in 1565 and its place taken by a number of petty and weak states. It was easy to appeal to their greed or override them with armed strength. The English opened their first factory in the south at Masulipatanam in 1611, but they soon shifted the center of their activity to Madras, the lease of which was granted to them by the local Raja in 1639. The Raja authorized them to fortify the place, administer it, and coin money on condition of payment to him of half of the customs revenue of the port. Here, the English built a small fort around their factory called Fort St. George. Interestingly enough, from the very beginning, this company of profit seeking merchants was also determined to make Indians pay for the conquest of their own country. For example, the court of directors of the company wrote to the Madras authorities in 1683, "We would have you to strengthen and fortify our fort and town Madras by degrees, that it may be terrible against the assault of any Indian prince and the Dutch power of India. But we must needs desire you so to continue your business, but with all gentleness, that the inhabitants may pay the full charge of all repairs and fortifications." The islands of Bombay was acquired by the East India Company from the British government in 1668 and was immediately fortified. In Bombay, the English found a large and easy to defend port. For that reason, because English trade was threatened at the time by the rising Maratha power, Bombay soon superseded Surat as the headquarters of the company on the west coast. In eastern India, the English company had opened its first factories in Orissa in 1633. In 1651, it was given permission to trade at Hooghly in Bengal. It soon opened factories at Patna in Bihar, Balasore in Orissa, and Dhaka and other places in Bengal. It now decided that in Bengal too it should have an independent settlement. It dreamed of establishing political power in India which would enable it to complete the Mughals, to allow them a free hand in trade, to force Indians to sell sheep and buy deer, to keep their rival European traders out, and to make its trade independent of the policies of the Indian powers. Political power would also make it possible for it to appropriate Indian revenues and thus to conquer the country with its own resources. Such plans were explicitly put forward at the time. In 1687, the directors advised the governors of Madras to establish such a policy of civil and military power and create and secure such a large revenue to maintain both as may be the foundation of a large, well grounded, secure English dominion in India for all time to come. In 1689, they declared, "The increase of our revenue is the subject of our care as much as our trade. 'Tis that must maintain our force. When 20 accidents may interrupt our trade, 'tis that must make us a nation in India." Hostilities between the English and the Mughal emperor broke out in 1686 after the former had sacked Hooghly and declared war on the emperor, but the English had seriously misjudged the situation and underestimated Mughal strength. The Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb was even now more than a match for the petty forces of the East India Company. The war ended disastrously for them. They were driven out of their factories in Bengal and compelled to seek refuge in the fever-stricken islands at the mouth of the Ganga. Their factories at Surat, Masulipatam, and Vishakhapatnam were seized, and their fort at Bombay besieged, having discovered that they were not yet strong enough to fight the Mughal power. The English once again became humble petitioners and submitted that the ill crimes they have done may be pardoned. They expressed their willingness to trade under the protection of the Indian rulers. Obviously, they had learned their lesson. Once again, they relied on flattery and humble entreaties to get trading concessions from the Mughal emperor. The Mughal authorities readily pardoned the English folly as they had no means of knowing that these harmless looking foreign traders would one day pose a serious threat to the country. Instead, they recognized that a foreign trade carried on by the company benefited Indian artisans and merchants and thereby enriched the state treasury. Moreover, the English, though weak on land, were because of their naval supremacy capable of completely running Indian trade and shipping to Iran, West Asia, Northern and Eastern Africa, and East Asia. Aurangzeb therefore permitted them to resume trade on payment of Rs 1,50,000 as a compensation. In 1698, the company acquired the zamindari of the three villages Sutanati, Kalikata, and Govindapur, where it built Fort William around its factory. The villages soon grew into a city which came to be known as Calcutta. In 1717, the company secured from Emperor Farooq Siyar a farman confirming the privileges granted in 1691 and extending them to Gujarat and the Deccan. But during the first half of the 18th century, Bengal was ruled by strong Nawabs such as Murshid Qulla Khan and Alwardi Khan. They exercised strict control over the English traders and prevented them from missing their privileges, nor did they allow them to strengthen fortifications at Calcutta or to rule the city independently. Here, the East India Company remained a mere zamindar of the Nawab. Even though the political ambitions of the company were frustrated, its commercial affairs flourished as never before. Its imports from India into England increased from 5 lakh euros in 1708 to 1 1 crore 7 lakh 95,000 euros in 1740. British settlements in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta became the nuclei of flourishing cities. Large numbers of Indian merchants and bankers were attracted to these cities. This was due partly to the new commercial opportunities available in these cities and partly to the unsettled conditions and insecurity outside them caused by the breakup of the Mughal Empire. By the middle of the 18th century, the population of Madras had increased to 3 lakh, that of Calcutta to 2 lakh, and that of Bombay to 70,000. The Charter of 1600 granted the East India Company the exclusive privilege of trading east of the Cape of Good Hope for a period of 15 years. The company was a strictly closed corporation or a monopoly. In India, a factory of the company was generally a fortified area within which the warehouse, stores, offices, and houses of the company's employees were situated. It is to be noted that no manufacture was carried on in this factory. The company's servants were paid very low salaries. Their real income, for which they were so keen to take service in India, came from the permission the company granted them to carry on private trade within the country, while trade between India and Europe was reserved for the company. The Anglo-French struggle in South India. The East India the English East India Company's schemes of territorial conquests and political dominations, which had been frustrated by Aurangzeb at the end of the 17th century, were revived during the 1740s because of the visible decline of Mughal power. Nadir Shah's invention had revealed the decay of the central authority. But there was not much scope for foreign penetration in Western India, where the vigorous Marathas held sway, and in Eastern India, where Alwardi Khan maintained strict control. In Southern India, However, conditions were gradually becoming favorable to foreign adventurers, while central authority had dispersed from there after Aurangzeb's death. The strong hand of Nizam ul Mulk Asaf Jah was also withdrawn by his death in 1748. Moreover, the Maratha chiefs regularly invaded Hyderabad and the rest of the south, collecting Chowth. These raids resulted in politically unsettled conditions and administrative disorganization. The Carnatic was embroiled in fratricidal wars of succession. These conditions gave the foreigners an opportunity to expand their political influence and control over the affairs of the South Indian states. But the English were not alone in putting forward commercial and political claims. While they had, by the end of the 17th century, eliminated their Portuguese and Dutch rivals, France had appeared as a new rival for nearly 20 years, from 1744 to 1763. The French and the English were to wage a bitter war for control over the trade, wealth, and territory of India. The French East India Company was founded in 1664. It was firmly established at Chandar Nagore near Calcutta and Pondicherry on the east coast. The latter was fully fortified. The French company had some other factories at several ports on the east and the west coasts. It had also acquired control over the islands of Mauritius and Reunion in the Indian Ocean. The French East India Company was heavily dependent on the French government, which helped it by giving it treasury grants, subsidies, and loans, and in various other ways. Consequently, it was largely controlled by the government, which appointed its directors after 1723. State control of the company proved quite harmful to it. The French state of the time was autocratic, semi feudal, and unpopular, and suffered from corruption, inefficiency, and instability. Instead of being forward looking, it was decadent, bound by tradition, and in general unsuited to the times. Controlled by such a state could not but be injurious to the interests of the company. In 1742, war broke out in Europe between France and England. This war soon spread to India, where the two East India companies clashed with each other. In 1748, the general war between England and France ended. The war had ended. The rivalry in trade and over the possessions in India continued and had to be decided one way or another. Dupleix, the French Governor General at Pondicherry at this time, now evolved the strategy of using the well disciplined modern French army to intervene in the mutual quarrels among Indian princes and by supporting one against the other, securing monetary, commercial, or territorial favors from the victor. Thus, he planned to use the resources and armies of the local Rajas, Nawabs, and chiefs to serve the interests of the French company and to expel the English from India. The only barrier to the success of this strategy could have been the refusal of Indian rulers to permit such foreign intervention, but the Indian rulers were guided not by patriotism, but by a narrow minded pursuit of personal ambition and gain. They had little hesitation in inviting the foreigners to help them settle accounts with their internal rivals. In 1748, a situation arose in the Carnatic and Hyderabad which allowed full scope to Dupleix's talents for intrigue. In the Carnatic, Chand Sahib began to conspire against Nawab Anwaruddin, while in Hyderabad the death of Asaf Jah Nizam ul Mulk was followed by civil war between his son Nasir Gang and his grandson Muzaffar Gang. Dupleix seized this opportunity and concluded a secret treaty with Chand Sahib and Muzaffar Gang to help them with his well trained French and Indian forces. In 1749, the three allies defeated and killed Anwaruddin in a battle at Ambur. The later son Muhammad Ali fled to Tiruchirappalli. The rest of the Carnatic passed under the dominion of Chamda Sahib, who rewarded the French with a grant of 80 villages around Pondicherry. In Hyderabad, too, the French were successful. Nasir Jang was killed the Muzaffar Gang, became the Nizam or Viceroy of the Deccan. The new Nizam rewarded the French company by giving it territories near Pondicherry as well as the famous town of Masulipatnam. He gave a sum of Rs 5 lakh rupees to the company and another 5 lakh to its troops. Duplex received Rs 2 crores and a Jaguar worth Rs 10,000 a year. Moreover, he was made a honorary governor of Mughal dominance on the east coast from the river Krishna to Kanyakumari. Dupleix stationed his best officer busy at Hyderabad with a French army, while the ostensible purpose of this arrangement was to protect the Nizam from enemies. It was really aimed at maintaining French influence at his court. While Muzaffar Khan was marching towards his capital, he was accidentally killed. Busy immediately raised Salbat Jang, the third son of Nizam ul Mulk, to the throne. In return, the new Nizam granted the French the area in Andhra known as the Northern Sarkars, consisting of the four districts of Mustafa Nagar, Ellore, Rajahmundry, and Chikakol. The French power in South India was now at its height. Dupleix plans had succeeded beyond his dreams. The French had started out by trying to win Indian states as friends. They had ended by making them clients or satellites, but the English had not been silent spectators of their rival's success. To offset French influence and to increase their own. They had been interviewing with the Nasir gang and Muhammad Ali. In 1750, they decided to throw their entire strength behind Muhammad Ali. Robert Clive, a young clerk in the company's service, proposed that French pressure on Muhammad Ali be seized at Tiruchirappalli could be released by attacking Arcot, the capital of the Carnatic. The proposal was accepted and Clive assaulted and occupied Arcot with only 200 English and 300 Indian soldiers. As expected, Chand Sahib and the French were compelled to raise the siege of Tiruchirappalli. The French forces were repeatedly defeated. Chand Sahib was soon captured and killed. The French fortunes were now at the now at an ebb as their army and its generals had proved unequal to their English counterparts. In the end, the French government, weary of the heavy expense of the war in India and fearing the loss of its American colonies, initiated peace negotiations and agreed in 1754 to the English demand for the recall of Dupleix from India. This was to prove a big blow to the fortunes of the French company in India. The temporary peace between the two companies ended in 1756 when another war between England and France broke out. At the very beginning of the war, the English managed to gain control over Bengal. This has been discussed later in the chapter. After this event, there was little hope for the French cause in India. The rich resources of Bengal turned the scales decisively in favor of the English. The decisive battle of the war was fought at Vandivash on 22nd January 1760 when the English general Ayrecourt defeated Lally. Within a year, the French had lost all their possessions in India. The war ended in 1763 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The French factories in India were restored, but they could not longer be fortified or even adequately garrisoned with the troops. They could serve only as centers of trade. And now the French lived in India under British protection. The English, on the other hand, ruled the Indian Sea. Freed of all European rivals, they could now set about the task of conquering India. During their struggle with the French and their Indian allies, the English learnt a few important and valuable lessons. First, in the absence of nationalism in the country, they could advance their political schemes by taking advantage of the mutual quarrels of the Indian rulers. Second, the Western trained infantry, European or Indian armed with modern weapons and backed by artillery, could defeat the old style Indian armies with ease in pitched battles. Third, it was proved that the Indian soldier trained and armed in the European manner made as good a soldier as the European. And since the Indian soldiers too lacked a feeling of nationalism, he could be hired and employed by anyone willing to pay him well. The English now set out to create a powerful army consisting of Indian soldiers called sepoys and officers by Englishmen. With this army as its chief instrument and the vast resources of India trade and territories under its command, the English East India Company embarked on an area of wars and territorial expansion. British occupation of Bengal. The beginnings of British political sway over India may be traced to the Battle of Plassey in 1757 when the English East India Company's forces defeated Siraj ul Siraj ud Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. The earlier British struggle with the French in South India had been but a dress rehearsal. The lessons learned there were profitably applied in Bengal. Bengal was the most fertile and the richest of India's provinces. Its industries and commerce were well developed. The East India Company and its servants had highly profitable trading interests in the provinces. The company had secured valuable privileges in 1717 under a royal firman by the Mughal emperor, which had granted it the freedom to export and import their goods in Bengal without paying taxes and the right to issue passes or das tax for the movement of such goods. The company's servants were also permitted to trade but were not covered by this firman. They were required to pay the same taxes as Indian merchants. This firman was a perpetual source of conflict between the company and the Nawabs of Bengal. For one, it meant loss of revenue to the Bengal government. Second, the power to issue the tax for the company's goods was misused by the company's servants to evade taxes on their private trade. All the Nawabs of Bengal from Murshid Qul Khan to Alivardi Khan had objected to the English interpretation of the Farman of 1717. They had compelled the company to pay lump sums to their treasury and firmly suppressed the mistakes of the stocks. The company had been compelled to accept the authority of the Nawabs in the matter, but its servants had taken every opportunity to evade and defy this authority. Matters came to a head in 1756 when the young and quick tempered Siraj ud Dowlah succeeded his grandfather, Ali Vardi Khan. He demanded that the English trade on the same basis as in the times of Murshid Qila Khan. The English refused to comply as they felt strong after their victory over the French in South India. Instead of agreeing to pay taxes on their goods to the Nawabs, they levied heavy duties on Indian goods entertaining Calcutta, which was under their control. All this naturally annoyed and angered the young Nawab, who also suspected that the company was hostile to him and was favoring his rivals for the throne of Bengal. The breaking point came when, without taking the Nawab's permission, the company began to fortify Calcutta in expectation of the coming struggle with the French, who were stationed at this time at Chandar Nagore. Siraj rightly interpreted this action as an attack upon his sovereignty. How could an independent ruler permit a private company of merchants to build forts or to carry on private wars on his land? In other words, Siraj was willing to let the Europeans remain as merchants but not as masters. He ordered both the English and the French to demolish their fortifications at Calcutta and Chandar Nagore and to desist from fighting each other. While the French company obeyed his order, the English company refused to do so, for its ambitions had been within and its confidence enhanced by its victories in the Carnatic. It was now determined to remain in Bengal even against the wishes of the Nawab and to trade there on its own terms. It had acknowledged that the British government's right to control all its activities. It had quietly accepted restrictions on its trade and power imposed in Britain by the British government. Its right to trade with the East had been extinguished by the Parliament in 1693 when its charter was withdrawn. It had paid huge bribes to the king, the parliament, and the politicians of Britain. In 1 year alone, it had to pay 80,000 euros in bribes. Nevertheless, the English company demanded the absolute right to trade freely in Bengal, irrespective of the Bengal Nawab's orders. This amounted to a direct challenge to the Nawab's sovereignty. No ruler could possibly accept this position. Siraj ud Dowlah had the statesmanship to see the long term implications of the English designs. He decided to make them obey the laws of the land. Acting with great energy but with undue hasty and inadvocate preparation, Siraj ud Dowlah seized the English factory at Qasim Bachar, marched on to Calcutta, and occupied Fort William on 20 June 1756. He then retired from Calcutta to celebrate his easy victory, letting the English escape with their ships. This was a mistake, for he had underestimated the strength of the uh, underestimated the strength of his enemy. The English officials took refuge at Fulta near the sea, protected by their naval superiority. Here they waited for aid from Madras and in the meantime organized a web of intrigue and treachery with the leading men of the Nawab's court. Chief among these were Mir Jafar, the Mir Bakshi, Manik Chand, the officer in charge of Calcutta, Amichand, a rich merchant, Jagat Seth, the biggest banker of Bengal, and Kadim Khan, who commanded a large number of the Nawab's troops from Madras, came a strong naval and military force under Admiral Watson and Colonel Clive. Clive reconquered Calcutta in the beginning of 1757 and compelled the Nawab to consider all the demands of the English. The English, however, were not satisfied. They were aiming high. They had decided to install a more pliant tool in Siraj ud Dowlah's place. Having joined a conspiracy organized by the enemies of the young Nawab to place Mir Jafar on the throne of Bengal, they presented the youthful Nawab with an impossible set of demands. Both sides realized that a war to the finish would have to be fought between them. They made for battle on the field of Plassey, about 30 kilometers from Murshidabad, on 23rd June 1757. The fateful Battle of Plassey was a battle only in name. In all, the English lost 29 men, while the Nawab lost nearly 500. The major part of the Nawab's army, led by the traitors Mir Jafar and Rai Dulab, took no part in the fighting. Only a small group of the Nawab soldiers, led by Mir Madan and Mohan Lal, fought bravely and well. The Nawab was forced to flee and was captured and put to death by Mir Jafar's son Miran. The Battle of Plassey was followed, in the words of the Bengali poet Nabin Chandra Sen, by a night of eternal gloom for India. The English proclaimed Mir Jafar the Nawab of Bengal and set out to gather the reward. The company was granted the undisputed right to free trade in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. It also received the jamindari of the 24 Parganas near Calcutta. Mir Jafar paid a sum of Rs 177,000,000 as compensation for the attack on Calcutta to the company and the traders of the city. In addition, he paid large sums as gifts or bribes to the high officials of the company. Clive, for example, received over 2 million rupees, Watts over 1 million. Clive later estimated that the company and its servants had collected more than 30 million rupees from the puppet Nawab. It was also understood that British merchants and officials would no longer be asked to pay any taxes on their private trade. The Battle of Plassey was of immense historical importance. It paved the way for British mastery over Bengal and eventually over the whole of India. It boosted British prestige and by a single stroke raised them to the status of a major contender for the Indian Empire. The rich revenues of Bengal enabled them to organize a strong army, and made the course of the conquest of the rest of the country. Control over Bengal played a decisive role in the Anglo-French struggle. Lastly, the victory at Plassey enabled the company and its servants to amass untold wealth at the loss of the helpless people of Bengal. As British historians Edward Thompson at G.T. Garrett have remarked, to engineer a revolution had been revealed as the most paying game in the world. The gold lust unqualified since the hysteria that took hold of the Spaniards of Cortes and Pizarro's age filled the English mind. Bengal, in particular, was not to know peace again until it had been bled white. Even though Mir Jafar owed his position to the company, he soon regretted the bargain he had struck. His treasury was quickly emptied by the demands of a company's officials for presents and bribes. The lead in the matter being given by Clive himself. As Colonial Malleson has put it, the single aim of a company's officials was to grasp all they could to use Mir Jafar as a golden sack into which they could dip their hands at pleasure. The company itself was seized with unsurpassable great belief that the Kamdhenu had been found and that the wealth of Bengal was inexhaustible. The directions of the company ordered that Bengal should pay the expenses of the Bombay and Madras presidencies and purchase out of its revenue and all the company's exports from India. The company was no longer to merely trade with India, it was to use its control over the Nawab of Bengal to drain the wealth of the province. Mir Jafar soon discovered that it was impossible to meet the full demands of the company, and its officials who on their part began to criticize the Nawab for his inability to fulfill their expectations. And so in October 1760 they forced him to abdicate in favor of his son-in-law Mir Qasim, who rewarded his benefactors by granting the company the zamindari of the districts of Burdwan, Midnapur, and Chittagong, and giving handsome presents totaling 29 lakhs of rupees to the high English officials. Mir Qasim, however, belied English hopes and soon emerged as a threat to their position and designs in Bengal. He was an able, efficient, and strong ruler determined to free himself from foreign control. He realized that a full treasury and an efficient army were essential to maintain his independence. He therefore tried to prevent a public disorder to increase his income by removing corruption from revenue administration and to raise a modern and disciplined army along European lines. All this was not to the liking of the English. Most of all, they disliked the Nawab's attempts to check the misuse of the Farman of 1717 by the company's servants who demanded that their goods, whether destined for export or for internal use, be free of duties. This ensured the Indian merchants as they had to pay taxes from which the foreigners were given complete exemption. Moreover, the company's servants illegally sold the stocks or free passes to friendly Indian merchants who were thereby able to evade the internal customs duties. These abuses ran the honest Indian traders through unfair competition and deprived the Nawab of a very important source of revenue. In addition to this, the company and its servants forced the Indian officials and zamindars to give them presents and bribes. They compelled the Indian artisans, peasants, and merchants to sell their goods cheap but buy dear from them. People who refused were often flogged or imprisoned. These years have been described by a recent British historian Percival Spear as the period of open and unshamed plunder. In fact, the prosperity for which Bengal was renowned was being gradually destroyed. Mir Qasim realized that if these abuses continued, he could never hope to make Bengal strong or free himself of the company's control. He therefore took the drastic step of abolishing all duties on internal trade, thus giving his own subjects a concession that the English and seized by force. But the alien merchants were not willing to tolerate equality between themselves and Indians. They demanded the rhyme position of duties on Indian traders. The battle was about to being again. The truth of the matter was that there could not exist two masters in Bengal. While Mir Qasim believed that he was an independent ruler, the English demanded that he act as a merry tool in their hands, for had they not put him in power. Mir Qasim was defeated in a series of battles in 1763 and fled to Awadh, where he formed an alliance with Shuja ud Daulah, the Nawab of Awadh, and Shah Alam II, the fugitive Mughal emperor. The three allies clashed with the company's army at Buxar on 22 October 1764 and were thoroughly defeated. This was one of the most decisive battles of Indian history, for it demonstrated the superiority of English arms over the combined army of two of the major Indian powers. It firmly established the British as masters of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa and placed Awadh at their mercy. Clive, who had returned to Bengal in 1765 as its governor, decided to seize the chance of power in Bengal and to gradually transfer the authority of government from the Nawab to the company. In 1763, the British had restored Mir Jafar as Nawab and collected huge sums for the company and its high officials. On Mir Jafar's death, they placed his second son Nizam ul Daulah on the throne and, as a reward to themselves, made him sign a new treaty on 20 February 1765. By this treaty, the Nawab was to disband most of his army and to administer Bengal through a deputy Subadar who was to be nominated by the company and who could not be dismissed without its approval. The company thus gained supreme control over the administration or Nizamat of Bengal. The members of the Bengal Council of the company once again extracted nearly 15 lakhs of rupees from the new Nawab. From Shah Alam II, who was still the titular head of the Mughal Empire, the company secured the Diwani or the right to collect the revenue of Bihar, Bengal, and Orissa. Thus, its control over Bengal was legalized and the revenues of this most prosperous of Indian provinces placed at its command. In return, the company gave him a subsidy of 26 lakhs of rupees and secured for him the districts of Kora and Allahabad. The emperor resided in the fort of Allahabad for 6 years as a virtual prisoner of the English. The Nawab of Awadh, Shuja ud Daulah, was made to pay a war indemnity of 5 million rupees to the company. Moreover, the two signed an alliance by which the company promised to support the Nawab against an outside attack, provided he paid for the services of the troops sent to his aid. This alliance made the Nawab a dependent of the company. Dual systems of administration of Bengal. The East India Company became the real master of Bengal at least from 1765. Its army was in sole control of its defense and the supreme political power was in its hand. The Nawab depended for his internal and external security on the British. As the Diwan, the company directly collected its revenues, while through the right to nominate the deputy subardar, it controlled the Nizamat or the police and judicial powers. This arrangement is known in history as the dual or double government. It held a great advantage for the British. They had power without responsibility. The Nawab and his officials had the responsibility of administration, but not the power to discharge it. The weakness of the government could be blamed on the Indians while its fruits were gathered by the British. The consequences for the people of Bengal were distrustful. Neither the company nor the Nawab cared for their welfare. The company's servants now had the whole of Bengal to themselves, and their oppression of the people increased greatly. We can quite Clive himself. I shall only say that such a scene of anarchy, confusion, bravery, corruption, and extortion was never seen or heard of in any court but Bengal, nor such and so many fortunes acquired in so unjust and rapacious manner, the three provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa producing a clear revenue of E3 euro 3 euro millions sterling have been under the absolute management of the company's servants ever since Mir Jafar's restoration to the Subhaship, and they have, both civil and military, exacted and levied contributions from every man of power and consequences, from the Nawab down to the lowest Jamindar. The company's authorities, on their part, set out to gather the rich harvest and drain Bengal of its wealth. They stopped sending money from England to purchase Indian goods. Instead, they purchased these goods from the revenues of Bengal and sold them abroad. These were known as the company's investment and formed a part of its profits. On top of all this, the British government wanted its share of the rich price and in 1767 ordered the company to pay it 4 lakh per year. In the years 1766, 1767 and 1768 alone, nearly 5.7 euros million were drained from Bengal. The abuses of the dual government and the drain of wealth led to the impoverishment and exhaustion of that unlucky province. In 1770, Bengal suffered a famine which, in its effects, proved to be one of the most terrible famines known in human history. People died in lakhs, and nearly Bengal's population, one third of Bengal's population fell victim to its ravages. So the famine was due to the failure of the rains. Its effects were heightened by the company's policies. Wars under Warren Hastings 1772 to 85 and Cornwallis 1786 to 93. The East India Company had by 1772 become an important Indian power, and its directions in England and officials in India set out to consolidate their control over Bengal before beginning a new round of conquest. However, their habit of interfering in the internal affairs of the Indian states and their lust of territory and money soon involved them in a series of wars. In 1766, they joined the Nizam of Hyderabad in attacking Hyder Ali of Mysore. But Hyder Ali forced the Madras Council to sign a peace treaty on his terms. Then, in 1775, the English clashed with the Marathas. An intense struggle for power was taking place at the time among the Marathas between the supporters of the infant Peshwa Madhavrao II, led by Nana Padnis, the Raghunathan Rao. The British officials in Bombay decided to intervene on behalf of Raghunath Rao. They hoped thus to repeat the exploits of their countrymen in Madras and Bengal and reap the conquest monetary advantages. This involved them in a long war with the Marathas, which lasted from 1775 to 1782. This was a dark hour indeed for British power in India. All the Maratha chiefs were united behind the Peshwa and his chief minister, Nana Pant. The southern India powers had long been resenting the presence of the British among them. The Hyder Ali and the Nizam chose this moment to declare war against the company. Thus, the British were faced with the powerful combination of the Marathas, Mysore, and Hyderabad. Abroad, they were waging a losing war in their colonies in America, where the people had rebelled in 1776. They also had to counter the determined design of the French to exploit the difficulties of their old rival. The British in India were, however, led at this time by the energetic and experienced Governor General Warren Hastings. He acted with firm resolve and determination. Neither side won, and the war came to a standstill. Peace was concluded in 1782 with the Treaty of Salby, Salby, by which the status quo was maintained. It saved the British from the combined oppositions of Indian powers. This war, known in history as the First Anglo-Martha War, did not end in victory of their side, but it did give the British 20 years of peace with the Marthas, the strongest Indian powers of the day. The British utilized this period to consolidate their rule over the Bengal presidency, while the Martha chiefs frittered away their energy in bitter mutual squabbles. Moreover, the Treaty of Salbhai enabled to enabled the British to expert pressure on Mysore, as the Marthas promised to help them in recovering their territories from Hyder Ali. Once again, the British had succeeded in dividing the Indian powers. Meanwhile, war with Hyder Ali had again started in 1780. Repeating his earlier exploits, Hyder Ali inflicted on defeat after another on the British armies in the Carnatic and forced them to surrender in large numbers. He soon occupied almost the whole of the Carnatic, but once again, British arms or diplomacy saved the day. Warren Hastings bribed the Nizam with the cession of Guntur district and gained his withdrawal from the anti-British alliance. During 1781 to 82, he made peace with the Marathas and thus freed a large part of his army for use against Mysore. In July 1781, the British army under Ire Koti defeated Hyder Ali at Porto Novo and saved Madras. After Hyder Ali's death in December 1782, the war was carried on by his son Tipu Sultan. Since neither side was capable of overpowering the other, peace was signed between them in March 1784 and both sides restored all conquests. Thus, though the British had been shown to be too weak to defeat either the Marathas or Mysore, they had certainly proved their ability to hold their own in India. The third British encounter with Mysore was more fruitful from the British point of view. The peace of 1784 had not removed the grounds for struggle between Tipu and the British. It had merely postponed the struggle. The authorities of the East India Company were actually acutely hostile to Tipu. They looked upon him as their most formidable rival in the south and as the chief obstacle standing between them and complete domination over South India. Tipu, on his part, thoroughly disliked the English, saw them as the chief danger to his own independence and nurtured the ambition to expel them from India. War between the two began again in 1789 and ended in Tipu's defeat in 1792. By the Treaty of Sringapatnam, Tipu ceded half his territories to the English and their allies and paid 330 lakhs of rupees as indemnity. Expansion under Lord Wellesley 1798 to 1805. The next large-scale expansion of British rule in India occurred during the Governor Generalship of Lord Wellesley, who came to India in 1798 at a time when the British were looked in a life and death struggle with France all over the world. Till then, the British had followed the policy of consolidating their gains and resources in India and making territorial gains only when this could be done safely. Without antagonizing the major Indian powers, Lord Wellesley decided that the time was ripe for bringing as many Indian states as possible under British control. By 1797, the two strongest Indian powers, Mysore and the Marathas, had declined in power. Political conditions in India were propitious for a policy of expansion. Aggression was easy as well as profitable. To achieve his political aims, Wellesley relied on three methods: the system of subsidiary alliances, outright war, and the assumption of the territories of previously subordinated rules. While the practice of helping an Indian rule with a paid British force was quite old, it was given definite shape by Wellesley, who used it to subordinate the Indian states to the paramount authority of the company. Under his subsidiary alliance system, the ruler of the allying Indian state was compelled to accept the permanent stationing of a British force within his territory and to pay a subsidy for its maintenance. All this was done allegedly for his protection, but was in fact a form through which the Indian ruler paid tribute to the company. Sometimes the ruler ceded part of his territory instead of paying annual subsidy. The subsidiary treaty usually also instituted that the Indian ruler agreed to the posting at his court of a British resident, that he not employ any European in his service without the approval of the British, and that he not negotiate with any other Indian ruler without consulting the Governor General. In return, the British undertook to defend the ruler from his enemies. They also promised non interference in the internal affairs of the allied state, but his was a promise they seldom kept. In reality, by singing subsidiary alliance, an Indian state virtually signed away its independence. It lost the right of self defense, of maintaining diplomatic relations, of employing foreign experts, and of settling its disputes with its neighbors. In fact, the Indian ruler lost all vestiges of sovereignty in external matters and became increasingly subservient to the British resident, who interfered in the day-to-day administration of the state. In addition, the system tended to bring about the internal decay of the protected state. The cost of the subsidiary force provided by the British was very high and, in fact, much beyond the paying capacity of the state. The payment of the arbitrarily fixed and artificially bloated subsidy invariably disrupted the economy of the state and impoverished its people. The system of subsidiary alliances also led to the disbanding of the armies of the protected states. Lakhs of soldiers and officers were deprived of their livelihood, spreading misery and degradation in the country. Moreover, the rulers of protected states tended to neglect the interests of their people and to oppress them. As they no longer feared them, they had no incentive to be good rulers as they were fully protected by the British from domestic and foreign enemies. The subsidiary alliances system was, on the other hand, extremely advantageous to the British. They could now maintain a large army at the cost of the Indian states. This enabled them to fight wars far away from their own territories, since any war would occur in the territories either of the British ally or of the British enemy. They control the defense and foreign relations of the protected ally and had a powerful force stationed at the very heart of his lands and could therefore at a time of their choosing overthrow him and annex his territories by declaring him inefficient. As far as the British were concerned, the system of subsidiary alliances was, in the words of a British writer, a system of fattening allies as we fatten oxen till they were worthy of being devoured. Lord Wellesley signed his subsidiary treaties with the Nizam of Hyderabad in 1798 and 1800. In lieu of cash payment for the subsidiary forces, the Nizam ceded part of his territories to the company. The Nawab of Awadh was forced to sign a subsidiary treaty in 1801. In return for a larger subsidiary force, the Nawab was made to surrender to the British nearly half of his kingdom, consisting of Rohil Khan and the territory lying between the Ganga and the Jamuna. His own army was virtually disbanded, and the British had the right to station their troops in any part of his state. Wellesley dealt with Mysore, Carnatic, Tanjore, and Surat even more sternly. Tipu of Mysore would, of course, never agree to a subsidiary treaty. On the contrary, he was not reconciled to the loss of half of his territory in 1792. He worked incessantly to strengthen his forces for the inevitable struggle with the British. He entered into negotiations for an alliance with the revolutionary France. He sent missions to Afghanistan, Arabia, and Turkey to forego anti British alliance. The British army attacked and defeated Tipu in a brief but fierce war in 1799 before French help could reach him. Tipu still refused to beg for peace on humiliating terms. He proudly declared that it was better to die like a soldier. than to live a miserable dependent on the infills in the list of their pension Rajas and Nabobs. He met a heroes and on 4th May 1799 while defending his capital Srirangapatnam, his army remained loyal to him to the very end. Nearly half of Tipu's dominance were divided between the British and their ally and the Nizam. The reduced kingdom of Mysore was restored to the descendants of the original Rajas from whom Hyder Ali had seized power. A special treaty of subsidiary alliance was imposed on the new Raja, by which the Governor General was authorized to take over the administration of the state in case of necessity. Mysore was in fact made a complete dependency of the company. In 1801, Lord Wellesley forced a new treaty upon the puppet Nawab of Carnatic, compelling him to cede his kingdom to the company in return for a pension. The Madras Presidency, as it existed till 1947, was now created by attaching the Carnatic to territories seized from Mysore, including the Malabar. Similarly, the territories of the rulers of Tanjore and Surat were taken over and their rulers pensioned off. The Marathas were the only major Indian power left outside the sphere of British control. Wellesley now turned his attention towards them and began aggressive interference in their internal affairs. The Maratha Empire at his time consisted of a confederacy of five big chiefs, namely the Peshwa at Pune, the Gaikwad at Baroda, the Sindhi at Gwalior, the Holkar at Indore, and the Bhonsle at Nagpur. The Peshwa being the nominal head of the confederacy, but all of them were engaged in bitter fratricidal strife, blind to the real danger from the rapidly advancing foreigner. Wellesley had repeatedly offered a subsidiary alliance to the Peshwa and Scindia, but the far cited Nana Pandits had refused to fall into the trap. However, when on 25th October 1802, the day of the great festival of Diwali, Holkar defeated the combined armies of the Peshwa and Scindia. Peshwa Bazi Rao too rushed into the arms of the English on the fateful last day of 1802, signed the subsidiary treaty at Bassin. The victory had been a little too easy, and Wellesley was wrong in one respect. The proud Maratha chiefs would not surrender their great tradition of independence without a struggle. But even in this moment of their peril, they would not unite against their common enemy. When Scindia and Bhonsle fought the British, Holkar stood on the sidelines and Gaikwad gave help to the British. When Holkar took up arms, Bhonsle and Scindia nurtured their bonds. In the south, the British armies led by Arthur Wellesley defeated the combined armies of Scindia and Bhonsle at Asa in September 1803 and enter Argonne in November. In the north, Lord Lake routed Scindia's army at Laswari on 1st November and occupied Aligarh, Delhi, and Agra. Once again, the blind emperor of India became a pensioner of the company. The Maratha allies had to sue for peace. Both Scindia and Bhonsle became subsidiary allies of the company. They ceded part of their territories to the British, admitted British residents to their courts, and promised not to employ any Europeans without British approval. The British gained complete control over the Orissa coast and the territories between the Ganga and the Jamna. The Peshwa became a disgruntled puppet in their hands. Wellesley now turned his attention towards Holkar, but Yashwantrao Holkar proved more than a match for the British and fought British armies to a standstill. Holkar's ally, the Raja of Bharatpur, inflicted heavy losses on Lake, who unsuccessfully attempted to storm his fort, moreover overcoming his age-old antagonism to the Holkar family. Sindhya began to think of joining hands with Holkar. On the other hand, the shareholders of the East India Company discovered that the policy of expansion through war was proving costly and reducing their profits. The company's debt had increased from 17 million euros in 1997 to 31 euro millions in 1806. Moreover, Britain's finances were getting exhausted at a time when Napoleon was once again becoming a major threat in Europe. British statesmen and the directors of the company felt that the time had come to check further expansion, put an end to runners expenditure and to digest and consolidated Britain's recent gains in India. Wellesley was therefore recalled from India and the company made peace with Holkar in January 1806 by the Treaty of Raigad, giving back to the Holkar the greater part of his territories. Wellesley's expansionist policy had been checked near the end. All the same, it had resulted in the East India Company becoming the paramount power in India. A young officer in the company's judicial service, Henry Robert Clough, wrote in about 1805. An Englishman in India is proud and tenacious. He feels himself a conqueror among a vanquished people and looks down with some degree of superiority on all below him. Expansion under Lord Hastings, 1813 to 22. The Second Anglo-Martha War had shattered the power of the Martha chiefs but not their spirit. They made a desperate last attempt to regain their independence and old prestige in 1817. The lead in organizing a united front of the Martha chiefs was taken by the Peshwa, who was smarting under the rigid control exercised by the British resident. The Peshwa attacked the British residency at Pune in November 1817. Appa Sahib of Nagpur attacked the residency at Nagpur and Madhavra Holkar made preparations for war. The Governor General Lord Hastings struck back with a characteristic vigor. He compelled Scindia to accept British suzerainty and defeated the armies of the Peshwa, Bonsle and Holkar. The Peshwa was dethroned and pensioned off at Bithor near Kanpur. His territories were annexed and the enlarged presidency of Bombay brought into existence. Holkar and Bonsle accepted subsidiary forces to satisfy Maratha pride. The small kingdom of Satara was founded out of the Peshwa's land and given to the descendant of Chhatrapati Shivaji, who ruled it as a complete dependent of the British. Like other rulers of Indian states, the Maratha chiefs too existed from now on at the mercy of British power. The Rajputana states had been dominated for several decades by Scindia and Holkar. After the downfall of the Marathas, they lacked the energy to reassert their independence and readily accepted British supremacy. Thus, by 1818, the entire Indian subcontinent, excepting the Punjab and Sindhia, had been brought under British control. Part of it was ruled directly by the British, and the rest by a host of Indian rulers over whom the British exercised paramount power. These states had virtually no armed forces of their own, nor did they have any independent foreign relations. They paid heavily for the British forces stationed in their territories to control them. They were autonomous in their internal affairs, but even in this respect, they acknowledged that British authority, wielded through a resident. They were on perpetual probation. The consolidation of British power, 1818 to 57. The British completed the task of conquering the whole of India from 1818 to 1857. Sindh and the Punjab were conquered and Awadh, the central provinces, and a large number of other petty states were annexed. The conquest of Sindh occurred as a result of the growing Anglo-Russian rivalry in Europe and Asia and the consequent British fears that Russia might attack India through Afghanistan or Persia. To counter Russia, the British government decided to increase its influence in Afghanistan and Persia. It further felt that this policy could be successfully pursued only if Sindh was brought under British control. The commercial possibilities of the river Sindh were an additional attraction. The roads and rivers of Sindh were open to British trade by a treaty in 1832. The chiefs of Sindh, known as Amirs, were made to sign a subsidiary treaty in 1839, and finally, in spite of previous assurances that its territorial integrity would be respected, Sindh was annexed in 1843 after a bright campaigning by Sir Charles Napier, who had earlier written in his diary, "We have no right to seize Sindh, yet we shall do so, and a very advantageous, useful, humane piece of rascality it will be." He received 7 lakhs of rupees as prize money for accomplishing the task. The conquest of the Punjab. The death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh in June 1839 was followed by political instability and rapid changes of government in the Punjab. Selfish and corrupt leaders came to the fore. Ultimately, power fell into the hands of the brave and patriotic but utterly indisciplined army. This led the British to look greedily across the settlers upon the land of the five rivers, even though they had signed a treaty of a perpetual friendship with Ranjit Singh in 1809. The Punjab army let itself be provoked by the warlike actions of the British and their intrigues with the corrupt chiefs of the Punjab. In the autumn of 1845, news reached Punjab that boats designed to form bridges had been dispatched from Bombay to Ferozpur on the settlers. Barracks for additional troops were built in the forward area and additional regiments began to be dispatched to the frontier with the Punjab. The Punjab army now convinced that the British were determined to occupy the Punjab to counter measures when it heard in December that Lord Gough, the commander in chief, and Lord Harding, the Governor General, were marching towards Ferozpur. It decided to strike. War between the two was thus declared on 13 December 1845. The danger from the foreigner immediately united the Hindus, the Muslims, and the Sikhs. The Punjab army fought heroically and with exemplary courage, but some of its leaders had already turned traitors. The Prime Minister Raja Lal Singh and the Commander in Chief Mr. Misar Tej Singh were secretly corresponding with the enemy. The Punjab army was forced to concede defeated and to sign the humiliating Treaty of Lahore on 8th March 1846. The British annexed the Jalandhar Dhob and handed over Jammu and Kashmir to Raja Gulab Singh Dogra for a cash payment of 5 million rupees. The Punjab army was reduced to 20,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, and a strong British force was stationed at Lahore. Later on, 16 December 1846, another treaty was signed giving the British resident at Lahore full authority over all matters in every department of the state. Moreover, the British were permitted to station their troops in any part of the state. From now on, the British resident became the real ruler of the Punjab, which lost its independence and became a vassal state. But the aggressively imperialistic sections of British official, officialdom in India were still unsatisfied, for they wanted to impose direct British rule over the Punjab. Their opportunity came in 1848 when the freedom loving Punjabs rose up in numerous local revolts. Two of the prominent revolts were led by Malraj at Multan and Chattar Singh at Tariwala near Lahore. The Punjabis were once again decisively defeated. Lord Dalhousie seized this opportunity to annex the Punjab. Thus, the last independent state of India was absorbed in the British Empire. Dalhousie and the policy of annexation, 1848 to 56. Lord Dalhousie came out to India as the Governor General in 1848. He was from the beginning determined to extend direct British rule over as large an area as possible. He had declared that the extension of all native states of India is just a question of time. The underlying motive of this policy was the expansion of British exports to India. Dalhousie, like other aggressive imperialists, believed that British exports to the native states of India were suffering because of the maladministration of these states by their Indian rulers. Moreover, they thought that their Indian allies had already served the purpose of facilitating British conquest of India and could now be got rid of profitably. The chief instrument, though, which Lord Dalhousie implemented his policy of annexation was the doctrine of lapse. Under this doctrine, when the ruler of a protected state died without a natural heir, his state was not to pass to an adopted heir as sanctioned by the age old tradition of the country. Instead, it was to be annexed to British India unless the adoption had been clearly approved Earlier by the British authorities, many states, including Satara in 1848 and Nagpur and Jhansi in 1854, were annexed by applying this doctrine. Dalhousie also refused to recognize the titles of many ex rulers or pay their pensions. Thus, the titles of the Nawabs of Carnatic and of Surat and of the Raja of Tanjore were cancelled. Similarly, after the death of the ex Peshwa Bazirao II, who had been made the Raja of Bitur, Dalhousie refused to extend his pay or pension to his adopted son Nana Sahib. Dalhousie was keen on annexing the kingdom of Awadh, but the task presented certain difficulties. For one, the Nawabs of Awadh had been British allies since the Battle of Buxar. Moreover, they had been most obedient to the British over the years. The Nawab of Awadh had many heirs and could not therefore be covered by the doctrine of lapse. Some other pretext had to be found to deprive him of his dominance. Finally, Lord Dalhousie hit upon the idea of alleviating the plight of the people of Awadh. Nawab Wajid Ali Shah was accused of having misgoverned his state and of refusing to introduce reforms. His state was therefore annexed in 1856. Undoubtedly, the degeneration of the administration of Awadh was a painful reality for its people. The Nawabs of Awadh, like other princes of the day, were selfish rulers absorbed in self indulgence who cared little for good administration or for the welfare of the people. But the responsibility for this state of affairs was in part that of the British who had, at least since 1801, controlled and indirectly governed Awadh. In reality, it was the immense potential of Awadh as a market for Manchester goods which existed Dalhousie's greed and eroded his philanthropic feelings, and for similar reasons to satisfy Britain's growing demand for raw cotton, Dalhousie took away the cotton producing province of Berar from the Nizam in 1853. It needs to be clearly understood that the question of the maintenance or annexation of native states was of no great relevance at this time. In fact, there were no Indian states in existence at that time. The protected native states were as much as part of the British Empire as the territories ruled directly by the company. If the form of British control over some of these states was changed, it was to suit British convenience. The interests of their people had little to do with the change. Thank you.